Anyway, we're glad to see you all here. Hey, I heard an interesting story. Janice, her husband had passed away, and you all know if you've ever had a loved one that's passed, there's a lot of things you got to do immediately when something like that takes place. And so she was running the errands. She had been to the post office, and she had been to the bank, and she had been to meet with the funeral director, and the other thing she had to do, she wanted to make sure that the obituary got posted in a newspaper. So she had typed up this 4-page glowing description of her husband, and she took it down to the local newspaper. And since she was running those errands anyway, and was going to drop it off personally, and so she walked in. The receptionist greeted her, and she said, "Here, I want to turn in the obituary for my husband to be printed in the paper." And she said, "Ma'am, before you leave, I'm sorry to tell you, you got 4 pages here. It's 40 cents a word." And she thought for a moment. She said, "Well, give me a piece of paper." And she gave her a piece of paper, and so she just wrote down, "Jim Woods dies." And she handed it back. She figured $1.20, that wouldn't be too bad. So she hands it back, and the lady said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry again, but it's a 7-word minimum." So she did some quick counting on her fingers, and she goes, "Okay, Jim Woods dies, 2014 truck for sale." That's what my wife's going to do to me. And that's okay. Over the past month, we've been talking about really some serious subjects, and certainly death is one of them. We've been talking about, things that we all deal with. We've talked about the idea of guilt and how we carry guilt around we shouldn't be carrying, and then some of us don't feel guilty for some things we should feel guilty about. We talked extensively about the idea of resentment and how bitterness and that bitter root that you allow to grow up in you can ruin anything and everything around you if you're not careful, especially your relationships, both vertically and horizontally as well. And then we spent some time talking about the idea of inferiority, that for every one of us, we have some fears and some insecurities, things that we're not, comfortable with, and as a result, it holds us back from being and reaching our full potential of who God has called us to be. And so we're talking about the idea of getting healthy. And I'm not just talking about from a physical point of view. I'm talking about from an emotional, from a mental, from a spiritual point of view. And so today I'm kind of wrapping up this series. We're going to head into the Easter idea, and the stage is going to change next week, and we're going to have a lot of things different, and we're going to pursue that. But I want to talk to you today as I wrap this series up about something that actually is very important. And although it's a nice day out and things are good, and we're going to leave on a very upbeat moment here at the conclusion, I want to talk to you about grief. I want to talk to you about grief because it seems like we've had a lot of it around us. And if it's not been around us personally, we're reading about it, we're seeing about it all the time. And so, if it hasn't happened to you already, I just want you to know that a time is coming when somebody who is very close to you is going to leave this world. They're going to die. And my question is, are you kind of ready for that? Have you thought about that? And when that loved one dies, are you going to be a person that's going to be able to move in a new chapter of life in a positive way, or are you going to be a person that maybe is going to get stuck in that? And that may not sound like a big deal to you right now, but I guarantee you at a moment in time, in the future, it will. Solomon, who was the second wisest man to ever walk next to Jesus, wrote to us some important words in Ecclesiastes 3 when he said there's a time to laugh and there's a time to mourn, there's a time to be born, and then there's a time to die. Now, the best example that I could think of anyone in Scripture who experienced grief on an incredible level to give us an idea of how to deal with it was this guy named Job. Now, you've probably heard of Job. He's got a whole book in the Old Testament, kind of in the poetry section of the Bible, of the Old Testament. If you haven't read it, I would encourage you to read it. But perhaps nobody in history has ever had more reason to mourn than Job did. And yet, as the book of Job recounts not only the tragic experience that he went through, it also talks about the blessing of God that followed this tragic experience, which can follow all of us as well. Maybe in a different way, but certainly it can follow. So what I want to do for the next few moments is I want to look at the things that Job lost. And then I want us to see how he recovered, the process that he went through. And hopefully, before you leave here, we're going to have a few lessons that we can take home with us with regard to how we can heal from pain and from grief that's inevitably coming to every single one of us. So first of all, let's take a look at for a moment at Job's tragic losses. I want you to note that first of all, one of the things that he lost that almost everyone in this room has experienced on some level was he lost all of his wealth. Now, I don't know if you've ever experienced having to start over in life again. I have. And I can tell you that that will cause you to mourn. It will cause you to grieve in a way that maybe you've never experienced before. But in a moment's time, Job lost everything that he had. In Job chapter 1, verse 3, it says, in the land of Uz where the man lived by the name of Job, this man was blameless, he was upright, he feared God, he shunned evil, he was a great guy. And listen to what he had. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters. He owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among the people of the East. In other words, particularly for that day, he was a man who was extremely wealthy. The livestock that he had alone would have been worth millions in today's economy. But in a matter of hours, and I'm making a long story short for you, in a matter of hours, Job lost it all. Every single thing that he had was dead. All of his livestock were gone. And even the servants who tried to protect them were killed in the process. And all that happened, I want you to note, at a time when there was no insurance. FEMA didn't show up on the scene. Leesburg did not distribute 17,000 bottles of water to Job and his extended family. None of that kind of support was there. So my point is that Job went from the penthouse to the poorhouse in just a very, very, very short period of time. Now, grief is an emotion that we all experience when we lose something that's very valuable to us. And we all know what it is to grieve when we lose someone that we love. But we also can grieve when we lose stuff, possessions, homes, things that we've worked very hard for our entire lives. Maybe you're grieving here today because you've lost a position, a job that you always wanted to have, and you don't have that opportunity anymore. Or it's never going to be available to you again in the future. Or maybe you're here today and you're grieving a relationship that's lost. Maybe it was through divorce. And you don't know if you're ever going to be able to get over that hump and let down the walls that you've built to protect your heart and your mind from ever loving again. I know that a lot of people have experienced with it. I've talked to dozens of people who have been here over the years at Leesburg Christian Church, and because of retirement or job, they've moved away, and they will call me, and they're just, really upset because they're saying, you know what, we've looked around, we can't find a church like Leesburg around here anywhere. And they literally are grieving the loss of their home church, the ministry that they've been involved in. You can grieve over a lot of different things. That's what I'm trying to get at. Job lost his possessions, but then, and that's bad enough, but stuff is stuff, right? Then he really lost something that was very, very valuable to him. He lost his children. Well, which ones? All of them. 7 sons and 3 daughters. Verse 18 and 19. While he was still speaking, another messenger came and said, your sons and daughters were feasting and drinking wine at the older brother's house when all of a sudden a mighty wind swept in from the desert and struck the 4 corners of the house, and it collapsed on them, and they are all dead. I am the only one who has escaped to tell you. That's what you call a tragedy. If someone you love dies slowly because of a diagnosis that they've got, that's harsh news enough, but at least you have some time. You have time to say goodbye. You have time to maybe, express love or resolve whatever issues that you have. But when somebody dies unexpectedly like this in an incident, such as the one we've had described, it's a shock. And you feel cheated because you didn't have the opportunity to say what you wanted to say. Or maybe you even feel like their death, and I've talked to a lot of people about this, is your fault because you didn't do something or say something or prevent something that in hindsight you would have if you'd had the opportunity. But to have 10 children die all at once is beyond my comprehension. I can't even imagine that. Not to mention the fact that children aren't supposed to die before their parents anyway, right? In the natural order of things, let alone 10 of them all at once. But then in addition to his loss of his wealth and his children, Job lost something that some of you all have experienced and are experiencing right here, maybe even yet today. Something a little bit more closer to home, a little bit more personal. He lost his health. Have you grieved over the fact that maybe you aren't the man or the woman or the person that you used to be because of health? You ever feel like that? In chapter 2, verse 7, it says, Satan, he's the reason for we're all in this mess anyway. Satan went out from the presence of the Lord, and he afflicted Job with painful sores and soles of his feet from the soles of his feet to the crown of his head. Job's entire body was in jeopardy. Now, as you read through the book of Job, what you discover is what a mournful experience the loss of his health was. Because I'm telling you, this wasn't a cold. This wasn't arthritis. Job chapter 2, verse 12 tells us that his body was so disfigured from the ailment, the sores that he had all over him, that his friends couldn't even recognize him when they first saw him. In Job chapter 7, verse 14 tells us that as a result of how much pain he was in, he had night terrors. You ever have that experience? Where you wake up and you're in that sleeping night. Chapter 30, verse 28, we learn that there were so many scabs on his body that his body was literally black, like tar, from the scabs that covered him from the sole of his feet to the crown of his head. And elsewhere in the book, we learn that from his illness that he lost all kinds of weight, and he had a constant fever, and he had agonizing pain day and night. Terrible, terrible health. And Job had lost it all. You know, it's not uncommon for people today who endure intense grief to have health problems as well. Now, I know this is a little bit different situation, but I'm just telling you, I see this happen a lot. People who go through intense grief, they have health issues. It affects them physically. They have insomnia, they have headaches, a loss or increase of appetite, anxiety, a lack of interest in intimacy, extreme depression, nightmares or terrors are all common symptoms of grief. Many times, sometimes after a personal loss, people and I've had a lot of people tell me this, food doesn't taste the same. Music sounds hollow. You know, don't want to hear it anymore, what they used to love. Nothing seems to satisfy. Tears have a tendency to come at very strange and odd times and almost uncontrollable for no apparent reason. You may even be working and hear their voice like you used to. Or you may see someone who's walking on the street, and from behind you, it looks like them. They have the same stride, the same haircut, the same build. And you look twice, maybe 3 times, just to make sure. When I was 11 years old, my grandmother passed away. It was my first real encounter with family death. I had many since, but that was my first one. I'll never forget it. It was on a summer day, and I was mowing the backyard. And a neighbor came down and told me and interrupted me, scared me to death because, you know, when you're mowing, I had a little push mower, and when I was push mowing, and said, Sammy, I just want to tell you that your grandmother's passed away, and there's going to be someone here to get you shortly. And I just kind of turned and looked, and I just kept mowing. Because I didn't know how to respond. Completely new feeling to me. Eventually, somebody next door to where my grandparents lived came in a vehicle. They got me, and they took me over to the house where the coroner was there, the hearse was there that they used to pick up her body. There were several people that had gathered from the community at the house there, and we all gathered there. And I can just remember not having the words to express how I was feeling at age 11 at that time to the Harris grandparents that I was very close to. And then my mom came to me and she said, Sammy, she said, I want you to stay over here with your grandfather for a few days and keep him company and get things for him, make sure he's okay. You stay here. And so I was glad to do that, and I'll never forget it. I had a room in which I always stayed at that house, and so I went to bed that night and I slept that night. And the next morning, I woke up to this. He was standing over me, rubbing my cheek. That's how he always used to wake me up. And he went, Sambo, Sambo. And I opened my eyes, and I looked up, and he goes, where's your grandmother at? He said, I've looked over the whole house. I can't find her anywhere. Where is she? Have you seen her? I had no words. And then he just looked down at me, and I'll never forget his face. And he goes, oh, God, that's right. She's dead. And he went back to bed and slept till noon. Have you ever had that? You ever had that experience? Bet you have. Sometimes particularly when it first happens, you have this intense grief. You just don't know how to respond, right? And strange things come out of you that you never thought would come out of you. Job had intense grief. And not only did he have this incredible grief, but then the counsel that he got from the people that were close to him wasn't very good counsel either. I forewarn you that if you go through grief and you lose somebody close to you particularly, that people will come along to you and beside you, and they will tell you things, and you need to take it with a grain of salt, because sometimes people don't say what they really should say, certainly not from a biblical perspective. In Job's case, in chapter 2, verse 9, his wife, now don't be judgmental yet, his wife came to him and said, are you still maintaining your integrity? Curse God and die. Get it over with. I can't watch this anymore. Now you have to remember, as his wife, she had lost everything too. She lost, maybe even on a deeper emotional level. She gave birth to those kids. And she lost all of her wealth as well. Pain, and people who are experiencing grief, pain will cause you to say things you wouldn't otherwise say under normal conditions. Cause you to do things that you wouldn't normally do. And like many today, Job's wife couldn't understand, if God's a loving God, then why did he let this tragedy happen to such good people? Right? Why did this happen? And so she says, just curse God and die. But look at Job's response in verse 10. He says, you're talking like a foolish woman. And then he asks a question. Mark it. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble? Are you just going to take the good that comes from God and not trouble? What about you? Because we live in a cursed world that's full of trouble, right? You know, I've been involved with death and dying my whole adult life, and even as a young person, and I have seen the loss of a family member do some crazy things to families. I have seen the loss of a child split a 20-year marriage up because each one blamed the other one for the death of their child. That's the game that Satan's involved with. And some of that came from bad counsel from other family members and friends. So as a warning, I just want to tell you today, if tragedy like this strikes your marriage, it is so important. It is so important that the two of you hold on closely to one another, communicate, but most importantly, continue to worship God together as you allow the wound to heal. And maybe one of the things that you need to understand is something for a long time, even though I had heard it, I didn't really let it sink in. You need to understand that there is a cycle that everybody goes through when it comes to grief. And if you've never heard this, you need to take note of it. First of all, there's always that cycle, that first phase or stage. It's the shock that you go through, right? Where you're so numb by the news that you don't really know how to respond. Like I kept mowing the yard because what else was I going to do? Right? And after you get past the shock, then there's that idea of denial where you think, this isn't really happening. I'm going to wake up tomorrow. This nightmare is going to be over. This didn't really happen. That's where my grandfather was, right? You think that person's going to walk through the door at any moment. They're going to return. They're going to whatever. So you have shock and denial. Then you have that idea of anger. This is where Job's wife was. There's a bitterness that can overwhelm you. A madness you get toward God, right? A bitterness. Why didn't you prevent this? You can even have anger toward the person who died. I stood at a casket with a lady, midlife, who lost her husband, and I was there to comfort her, and I was shocked when she started cursing her dead husband for leaving her in what she described in this mess. Because of finances and family and commitments and stuff like that. Mad, even though she loved him dearly. Angry. And then after anger comes this idea of depression. And this sometimes can be one of the worst states because it's the most prolonged one. You experience times of sorrow that seem to drag on and on. One day you're restless and you got a lot of energy. The next day you're apathetic and you don't want to do anything. One day you're semi-normal. The next day you don't think you can go on. And then there's all those the first holidays, the first birthdays, the first anniversaries with that chair empty, without that person around. That's always very, very difficult. It's tough. But eventually, after those 4 phases of the cycle, there comes then the acceptance phase and returning back to life. Slowly you return to the mainstream of living and you realize the sun is going to come up. Life is going to continue to move on. Now I will tell you that most mental health care professionals, and I would agree, say, because of experience is why I'm agreeing, not because I'm an expert, that it takes about 2 years to go through the grief process in a healthy fashion or form. And if it goes on much longer beyond that, I really would recommend that maybe you seek some professional help or counseling to be able to help you get through that. But Job's wife, as she told him to curse God and die, was stuck in the bitterness or the anger part of that cycle at that moment. And then Job had some friends that came to visit him. You ever have friends that come to visit you in a crisis and they end up causing more harm than good, even though their intentions are well? Well, in chapter 2, verses 11 through 13, it says, when Job's 3 friends heard about all the troubles that had come upon him, they set out from their homes. They met together by agreement to go sympathize with him and to comfort him. And when they saw him from a distance, they could hardly recognize him because of all of his health issues. They began to weep aloud. They tore their robes, sprinkled dust on their heads, and they sat on the ground with him for 7 days and 7 nights, and no one said a word to him because they saw how great a suffering he was going through. Now, I'm going to tell you that this point in the game, these guys did some good things. They did some things right. They cared enough to show up. That's always important. Sometimes it's not about what we say, like places, like when we go, I get people say, Sammy, I'm going to this funeral and I don't know what to say. And I said, you don't have to say anything. Just go. Just show up. Quite honestly, I go to funerals all the time and I talk a lot and people never remember what I say, but they always remember I showed up, that I was there. The worst thing you can do when someone's experiencing grief is to do nothing. So Job's friends did come and they sympathized with him, and for a week they just stood by. They were just there. And that was a good thing if they would have left it at that. But sometimes people don't know when to leave well enough alone, right? And they didn't. Most of the rest of the book of Job is this dialogue between Job and his friends while they're trying their best to explain to Job why all this pain and suffering is coming his way. You ever have anybody do that with you? They try to analyze your situation to tell you why it is you're going through this horrible thing. Like, for instance, they tried to explain to him, well, maybe, Job, you got some kind of unconfessed sin going on in your life, and that's why all this bad stuff's happening to you. See? You know, the letter of Galatians over in the New Testament tells us that as Christ followers, we're to bear one another's burdens. Being there is one thing, and that's a good thing to help somebody get through whatever pain or grief that they're going through. But trying to analyze the why they're going through it is a very dangerous game to play if you're not very, very biblically well equipped to handle that. You can really mess somebody up in their relationship with God as well as with others if you're not very careful and do more damage. Prior to COVID-19, for the 2 previous years, I taught helped lead a 13-week course called Grief Share, which I'm sold on 100%. It did more for me leading that. I thought I was doing it to help other people, and it ended up really being a great healing for me. And I would encourage you to check into that moving forward as we offer that again. But one of the primary lessons that I learned through that is that the grief process that leads to good health, not just mentally and physically, but even spiritually, it takes time. It takes time on all the people involved, not just the person who's directly, affected by it, but all those who support. It takes time for the person who's burdened with this grief. And here's what I want to suggest to you. After leading this and hearing the feedback from over 40-some people in those 2 sessions of all ages that were going through grief of all kinds of death, here's one of the things that I learned from them. I said, I asked them the question, what is the number one thing that annoyed you initially, particularly when you lost so-and-so? And a very common response was that when people come up to you, and instead of just trying to be an encouragement, they do the pity face. You know what I'm talking about? Where every time they see you, they go, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I've been praying for you. I know it's been so difficult and so hard." And they said, how in the world am I ever going to move on when I got that going on every time I run into somebody? You see, we need to express that we care, but sometimes doing that kind of pity thing can do actually more damage than good. I think there's a balance that we have to offer, and just through experience in ministry, I've kind of learned that instinctively, how to do that, where you balance sincerity even with a little bit of humor, because I have looked at my role as to try to lighten the mood of individuals and try to be encouraging, talking about positive things. So just remember that that's very important. I had a funeral not too long ago, a while back, where I knew the family very well, where the husband had died, and I had known them for a long time, so I felt like I had earned the ability to be honest about the situation. And so I stood up at the funeral and I said, the man who lays before us today was a good man, but I'd be standing up here lying to you today if I didn't say that he was the most cantankerous, stubborn, hard-headed individual that I have ever met. And immediately his wife, who was sitting on the front row, said, "Amen to that." Tears running down her cheeks. And I said, and I loved him. And she went, "Me too." See? That's the kind of balance that we need to have when we talk to people. Now, it may surprise you to see how Job responded to his grief and losses. You've probably heard somebody in your past, some older person say, "Well, they've got the patience of Job." Well, this is where it comes from. He did have an amazing faith. He asked the question, shall we accept good from God, not from trouble, and not trouble? What about you? Are you willing to be here and serve and give and smile just when things are going well? Or are you able to do it during tough times too? Because they're coming, right? Elsewhere, Job said, even if God slays me, I'm going to trust him. Now, he knew that God didn't have his finger, slaying him. But he said, even if he did, I'm still going to trust him because the Lord gives and takes away. That's kind of how he set it all up, the natural processes. But blessed be the name of the Lord. Job had an incredible faith. And you know what I've observed over the years? I've observed that when people go through grief, one day they're full of faith and the next day they're not. They're full of doubts. And that's natural. Don't beat yourself up for that. One day they think God is good, and the next day they can't stand God, and they blame him for the pain that they're going through. I want you to listen to a few of the things that this man of faith, Job, said that we don't focus in on a lot in this book, even though he was a man of faith. In chapter 3, verse 1, says, Job opened his mouth and cursed the day of his birth. Do you ever say in your grief, I just wish I'd never been born? Bet you have. In chapter 6, verse 2, he said, if only my anguish could be weighed, if you could weigh it and see all the misery that's placed on the scale, it would look like this. Right? In chapter 6, verse 15, he said, my brothers, my friends are as undependable as intermittent streams. The water. Can't depend on it. It's not consistent. In chapter 10, verse 1, he said, I loathe my very life. Therefore, I will freely give rein to my complaints and speak out of the bitterness of my soul. In other words, he's saying, I am going to cuss and fuss, and I don't care who hears it. In chapter 23, verse 2, he said, even today my complaint is bitter. His hand is heavy in spite of my groaning. What he's saying there is he's saying, God, explain this to me. Have you ever done that? You ever got to the point in your grief, explain this to me. This is the same guy who said, even though God will slay me, I'm going to trust him. But in this moment, and in these moments that I've just read to you, he's still feeling a little bit bitter. When you grieve, understand your emotions are going to fluctuate dramatically during that process, even if you believe. I have had the honor of presiding over the funeral of my mother, my grandmother, my nephew, my best friend, and the man that I considered my father. And when I did those funerals, I did them, and I never batted an eye. And everybody came up to me and they said, how in the world were you able to do that? What they don't see is when I walk away and I go to my office or I go to my truck and I lay my head on the steering wheel on the desk and I cry like a baby for about 45 minutes in my own personal solitude. They don't see that part. And even though I believe and I know and I'm assured of where they are and where we're all going, I'm still human and I still grieve and I still love those people and I miss them, even though I know it's only going to be a temporary separation. The Bible tells us that Jesus stood at the tomb of his friend Lazarus when he was buried, and he wept. He wept, even though he knew he was going to raise him from the dead. But I do have to confess this to you, and I don't say much good about me very often, but I will tell you that over the years, my grief doesn't stay prolonged anymore like it used to. And I think part of the reason is just experience. But I've really begun to tell myself and remind myself that God's promises are either real or they're not. Do I believe them or don't I? Right? And if I do, then I need to move on. I need to put on big boy pants and I just need to move on. The Bible doesn't say that it's wrong to grieve. The Bible says that we should not grieve as Christ followers, as people who do not have any hope. Right? Because we believe in Jesus, who said, believe in me, and even if you die, you're going to live. I really believe that. Do you? Do you really believe that? Hope you do. So Job went through these emotional ups and downs, and he pleaded with God to explain it to him. And after a prolonged period of mourning and complaining, God then came to Job, and he gave him some instruction about life. I want you to notice what God didn't do. He didn't give him an apology. He didn't say, oh, Job, I want to apologize as to why bad things happen to good people. Let me explain all that to you. He didn't do that. What he did is he reminded Job that he was the God who created the universe. And you can trust me. Because even if he explained it, he wouldn't understand it. So he said this in Job 38, 4 and 5. He said, where were you when I laid the earth's foundation? Tell me if you understand. Who marked off its dimensions? Surely you know. Who stretched a measuring line across it? He's reminding Job that it's our responsibility to trust God even when we don't understand. What is your better option? And Job's response was incredible. In chapter 40, verses 3 through 5, I'll just tell you what happened. He said, I'm not worthy to question anything that you do. I'm humbled by this, and I'm going to shut my mouth and say no more. That's what Job says. I'm just going to shut up. In chapter 42, verse 3, he says, "You ask, who is it that obscures my plans without knowledge? Surely I spoke these things, and I did not understand, things too wonderful for me to know." Job, in his humility, got it. I just need to trust God because I'm never going to figure it all out on this side of heaven. Job went through the whole cycle of grief, and he came to the point of acceptance, even though he didn't completely understand it, and he certainly couldn't explain it. He just said, the important thing is I'm going to trust God. What about you? And God understood, and as a result, God blessed Job's response. In chapter 42:10, after Job had prayed for his friends, the Lord restored his fortunes and gave him twice as much as he had before. The book of Job ends with these two verses, verse 16 and 17 in chapter 42. After this, Job lived 140 years. He saw his children and their children to the fourth generation, and Job died, and I love this line, an old man full of years. Full of years. Now, before we walk out of here, very quickly, I am going to give you three things I hope you will etch in your head, truths that I'm going to tell you, if you'll take them seriously, will get you through whatever grief you experience. So hear me. Number one, face the reality that grief is inevitable. So expect it. And by expect it, I mean plan for it. Predetermine how you're going to respond. The Bible makes it clear there's a time to mourn, a time to die, and a time to weep. All negative things. So don't go through life thinking, well, it's not ever going to happen to me, and if I'm good enough and give enough and go to church enough, it won't happen. Wrong. Not true. Now, I do not think that we ought to obsess over death to the point where we make everybody feel miserable about it all the time. If you're a parent or grandparent and your children are busy and it's your birthday, don't go, well, I might not have another one. Don't do that to your kids. People do it all the time. But don't be naive about it either. Be realistic and understand someday it's going to happen. That person ain't going to be here. And predetermine that you're not going to be devastated by it in a debilitating way when it does happen. You're a Christian. Walk in faith. Right? The second truth is this. So expect it. It's inevitable. The second truth is this. Faith is essential. Hold on to it for dear life. Do not let go of it. How are you going to get through grief without God? You want me to tell you how? You're not. You're going to drink. You're going to wallow. You're going to be miserable. And you're going to take a lot of people down with you. That's what you're going to do. So what are you going to do in your response? Let me ask you, parents and even grandparents, what are you going to model to your children about grief? I actually walked into a room, and I have to be careful what I say, because I know if I was sitting where you're saying, I would say, would he do that to me? I walked into a room with a friend that I've known for a long, long, long time, 30 plus years, and grabbed her up because of her wailing over her father who was dying, who was in his 90s. And I said, what are you doing? He's a Christian, you're a Christian, and your grandkids are out here in the other room watching you respond like in this infantile way, and you are teaching them how to deal with death. Grow up. And then I hugged her, and I laughed with her, and I prayed with her, and we talked. And things got on a whole different level. But we need to understand that if we're people of faith, we got to respond like that. And we got to predetermine to do it, right? And we got to have this faith, and we got to hold on to it, and we got to model it to those who come after us on how they're going to have to deal with maybe your death. And they're going to deal with it as they watch you deal with death. 1 Peter 1:6 says, "In all this greatly rejoice, for now you may have, as you suffer grief of all kinds, in all kinds of trials. Understand that death as a person of faith isn't final for us." I get so frustrated with people who claim to be Christian who talk as if death is it. If that's it, we're all here in vain. We should be somewhere else, doing something else right now. If death is it. There's coming a day, God has promised, when He is going to wipe all the tears from our eyes. There's going to be more pain, no sorrow, and no more death. And faith is essential. And if you hold on to it, it'll get you through, because Jesus said, "I'm the resurrection and life, and he who believes in me, even though he dies, yet shall he live. Expect it. Hold on to your faith. And thirdly, life is valuable. Live it while you still have the opportunity. There's a time to weep, but there also is a time to laugh. There's a time to mourn, but there's a time to dance again. And some of you have been mourning for too long and you need to dance again. There comes a time when you need to go on with life. And while things change, while there's not going to be somebody in that particular chair this holiday or birthday or whatever it may be, this season, while there comes a change, I want to tell you something from the bottom of my heart as your friend. Hear me. It is not a tribute to the person who died, nor is it any demonstration of faith to go for years and years and years wallowing in self-pity and in grief and talking to tombstones. And remember this, and maybe this is the one thing as Christians we tend to forget more than anything. While they cannot come to you, you can prepare to go to them. And that's why we're here, doing what we do. So live life. God has given you today to live, and we ought to be able to say with the psalmist, this is the day the Lord has made. I'm going to rejoice, and I'm going to be glad in it. So let me ask you a question. Are you able to trust God when it costs you something? Are you able to lean into Him during the most difficult times of life? Matthew Douglas Simpson's going to come out here. I know he's on his way. Told you. And I'm going to ask you to do something. I'm going to ask that you stay right where you are for a moment. I do not want you to get up. You can join in this if you want to. One of my favorite stories of all time, and I know there's a lot of you that haven't heard it, is a story about Horatio Spafford. I don't know if that name rings a bell to any of you or not. Horatio Spafford was a guy who lived in the 1800s in the Chicago area. He was an attorney. He was a lawyer in Chicago during the great fires of Chicago. And to get out of that situation, he put his family, his 4 daughters and his wife, on a ship to sail across the Atlantic to England, and he was going to join them later, and they were going to figure out how they were going to rebuild their business, their family business. And so he stayed behind to deal with the damage and the fire and what all it had done to help his city of Chicago. And when he got the message, the word, that the ship that he had put his wife and daughters on had went down, and all 4 daughters had died, had drowned, and his wife was saved alone. Her name was Anna. And the message that came back said simply this: saved alone, come quickly. As soon as he could, Horatio Spafford got on the next boat available, and he made his way over to join his wife to bury or to have a memorial service for his 4 daughters. When they got to the spot where the other ship went down, the captain sent a message to tell him, this is the place, this is where it all happened. And it was there Horatio Spafford penned the words to my favorite hymn. You're going to hear part of it right now. Moved by the sound of his voice, seas that are shaken and stirred can become broken for my God. And through it all,
through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well with me. Far be it from me to not believe, even when my eyes can't see. And this mountain that's in front of me will be thrown into the midst of the sea. And through it all, my eyes are on you. Through it all, it is well. And through it all, my eyes are on you. It is well. It is well.
That's what communion is about. It is to remind you and me that no matter what you're here and you may be grieving today, that it is well with your soul because of what He did and what He promised. Through it all, God is watching, He cares, and He loves you. We're going to conclude our service with a song of victory, and I want you to stand and I want you to sing this out. You've heard this song before, and I want you to be mindful of its words. And if you have a decision, we had a baptism last service, by the way, which is awesome. And if you have that decision, or if you want to join this church or rededicate or just need some prayer or whatever, feel free to come up after the service. We're here to help you in any way that we possibly can, okay? Let's stand and sing.
far be it from me to not believe, even when my eyes can't see. And this mountain that's in front of me will be thrown into the midst of the sea. And through it all, my eyes are on you. And through it all, it is well. And through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well. It is well. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know His name. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know His name. So let go, my soul, and trust in Him. The waves and wind still know His name. The waves and wind still know His name. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. It is well. It is well with my soul. And through it all, my eyes are on you. And through it all, it is well. And through it all, my eyes are on you, and it is well with me.
Heaven thundered, and the world will shout your praise forevermore. Jesus.